Last fall, I went to a pumpkin patch with my friend, and we went apple picking, and they had these really funny, ugly-looking gourds for really cheap. I was kind of in a creative rut or just like searching for something to do. I was just bored. I wanted to make an animation, and I had been animating a lot on one surface, meaning I would draw all the frames of an animation on a single sheet of paper. I was looking to do something like that, but I was kind of bored with doing it on paper, and I noticed that I had all of these gourds just sitting around on my windowsill. These gourds kind of resembled the like gross, lumpy, ugly portraits that I draw in my free time, and I was like, I love what they look like. I might as well try and see what it would look like to draw directly on their surface. So I created a really quick animation on the surface of this white gourd with markers. Looking back, I think it would have been really cool to also carve into the gourd, especially since it was around the time of Halloween. We actually took a trip to the grocery store, kind of shuffled through the vegetables and fruits that we had to find things that were kind of the right size that we were looking for, the right surface texture, the right color, and we even considered what the color of the inside of the fruit was, not just the skin. We actually took a razor blade to the supermarket, nicked a couple of the fruits to check what the interior looked like. An eggplant was perfect because it has this really nice dark exterior color that we can use paint markers with, so that provides a great contrast. I am literally just using an eggplant, some markers, and I will end up shooting it on my smartphone. These are paint markers. They're the drawing tool that I will be using to draw on the surface of the eggplant. They're a water-based marker, and they are very nice to draw on this dark surface of the eggplant because they're opaque, so there's no issue of not being able to see the color. In my original gourd animation that I made last fall, I only drew on the surface of the gourd. I was thinking about in the fall how carving is such a big thing for Halloween. I talked to Professor Lieu about it, and she has these carving tools for woodcut, which would be perfect for it. So I shuffled through the tools that she had, and I found a couple that would be perfect for creating the kind of cuts and texture that I was looking for. For this animation, I wanted to make sure that I started and continued with a pretty simple shape that maybe morphs into another shape, but I wanted it to be very simple so that there's not a lot of detail going on or difficult things to move from one frame to the other. So I started with a really small circle and decided to make it grow a little bit and then change into an oval. I was definitely improvising the whole time because I think that a lot of creating this is just figuring things out as you go, enjoying the process rather than worrying too much about the end result. I feel like that's a nice end surprise rather than something that you really need to be thinking about throughout this process. I tend to be a very quick, hasty animator. I make movements happen over very few frames rather than really letting things progress slowly. One thing I really like about animating on a surface, like this eggplant, for example, or just a sheet of paper and having all the frames exist on this one surface, is that this stands alone as a piece in itself. Your whole movie is on this one eggplant. Before I shoot the final animation, I want to do a quick test with the iPhone app that I'm going to use just to check that the movement is working, to see how tight my frame should be, and just check that I like what I see so I don't have to go back and make any adjustments. I created this contraption for the purposes of shooting the animation because it spins and allows me to place the eggplant on top of it and spin it as I take the photo so that I don't have to actually hold the eggplant in one hand, spin it, and shoot with the other hand. What this contraption is a Lazy Susan. It allows you to rotate. On the Lazy Susan, I've put this, which is museum putty. It's this tacky, malleable substance. I've cut a black mat board into the shape of a circle, and I will just press it on to the Lazy Susan, and that allows me to place the eggplant on top of it while rotating it really smoothly and easily. I also have a small piece of museum putty to put on the bottom of the eggplant so that it sits nicely and doesn't wall all over the place on top of the Lazy Susan. I'm going to kind of shape it so that it's almost in a dish shape with some edges sticking up so that it has a nice little divot for the eggplant to sit in. So I'm gonna place it right in the center, make sure the edges come up a little bit, and now I'm gonna place the eggplant on top and hope it stays. At this point, I'm reaching the bottom frames, so I'm gonna take the eggplant off of the Lazy Susan just so I have a better angle at the frames and just shoot it with holding it in my hand and rotating it like this and shooting it. The app that I'm using for this animation is called iMotion. I like it for the reason that it actually shoots in a square format, and most of my animations that I do like this, I post on Instagram, so that's like a nice workflow for me. Once you're previewing it, it gives you the option to adjust the speed in frames per second. So right now, we're seeing how this looks in 15 frames per second, and I like it quite a bit, but just for the sake of curiosity, I could bump it up to 24 and see how that changes. This is how it looks 30 frames per second, and then this is something like 6, which is really, really slow. And I don't really like that. This is 1, which is so slow. I think I'm gonna leave it at 15 frames per second because it gives a really nice sense of seamless movement, but it's not too fast where your eye isn't catching all the details that I've put in or not really understanding what the transformation is exactly. For me, this is the final product right here on my iPhone. My platforms tend to be Instagram for releasing these things, so I really just export it to my camera roll and then pop it right into Instagram. There are a lot of things that happen during animation that you don't account for while you're actually drawing the frames, and you only realize while you're taking the photographs of the frames. For example, while doing this, I realized that some of my drawings are so small that I had to get my camera really close to the eggplant to take the photographs, and this resulted in the image being kind of blurry in those sections. But I would say that those are like happy mistakes that add another layer of whatever to it. It's just kind of like an interesting visual effect. Another option is that you could carve into the vegetable or fruit that you're using rather than drawing onto the surface of it. I think this is a great option because you're actually utilizing the properties of the object that you're using. It would be good for you to be very specific and picky about what vegetable or fruit that you are using, because it would be great to have a stark contrast between the skin and the inside that it will be showing when you carve it out. For example, when Professor Lieu and I went to the supermarket, we had a razor blade with us and had to secretly nick these vegetables that we were looking at to make sure that the inside was a nice color in comparison to the outside, while also being very sneaky about it so that nobody noticed we were doing that. This is a yam, and while we were using our razor blade, we saw that the inside of the yam is a really bright white color, and the outside is this nice reddish purple, which works perfectly for the purposes of this animation. We tried it out with an apple, and if you carve into an apple, like this, you can see that there's not a lot of contrast between the skin of the apple, which is a yellow color, and the interior, which is a yellowish white color. So clearly this yam would be a much better option because when you go into it, that is just such a nice contrast in comparison to the apple. I actually really love working this way because it allows for so much experimentation and adaptation, and I really love the fact that you can change your idea midway or just kind of roll with the punches. For example, when I started this, I had originally wanted to just make these pretty standard basic lines going on throughout the whole thing and just seeing how this like almost identical line animated. But then as I got more into the motion of carving, I noticed that I kind of liked digging in there and like ripping pieces out and was making these huge divots and like circular forms, and then things just got thicker and I started to use one of the wider carving tools rather than the skinnier one that I was using, which totally transformed the shape of the indents I was making. And then as I went on, I just decided to experiment with what would happen if I just totally carved off the skin and just made it all white. So I'm excited to get this shot and see what happens when it's fully animated. So now I'm gonna preview it and see what it looks like. Wow, it's like really different from the marker tutorial. The movement is definitely not as like seamless, but it's really interesting. I'm gonna see what it looks like if I go faster. I like that I'm zoomed out and I can kind of like see that I'm holding it, just because it's like a different perspective and shows the process a little bit of like how I'm shooting this. Oh, I think I like that speed a lot. This is a funny like end result because there's so many different parts to it. Like there's some parts where the movement between each carving works really well, and there's some parts where literally it just looks like it's going crazy. But like together, I think it comes together nicely as like a final piece. This was a ton of fun to do and was a really great learning experience because it taught me a lot about the process of animation, learning to kind of go with the mistakes you make and just improvising, which is a really great exercise. And I think it reminded me also just not to worry too much about the end product and really learn while you're creating. Yeah. What is this? Here's my eggplant. It's that time of night where everything starts to become funny.